Hey, welcome to Transform Your Workplace. It's your host, Brandon Laws. Today's episode is brought to you by Xenium HR. As an HR professional or somebody who deals with the people side of the business, you probably get exhausted from managing multiple vendors for like payroll and HR and benefits and dealing with the ever-changing and evolving compliance that comes your way. Well, under Xenium's complete HR plus payroll solution, you can have all of those things under one roof with a dedicated HR business partner and payroll professional to support you along the way. Learn more about Xenium's complete HR plus payroll solution at xeniumhr.com. Well, today's guest needs no introduction. My guest today is Kim Scott, the author of Radical Candor, and she's out with a new book. It's called Radical Respect: How to Work Together Better. In this episode, we discuss how to build a culture of transparency, humanity, and collaboration. And you're going to enjoy this episode. It's packed with stories and examples. And I absolutely love this conversation with Kim. I know you're going to enjoy it. Make sure, if you're not a subscriber, go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google, Amazon Music, wherever you listen to this show, and hit the subscribe button. And if you'd be so kind as to share this with a friend, that's the best thing that you can do to spread the word about this show. And if you get a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts, that helps people like you find the show. Really appreciate the support. Make sure to connect with me on LinkedIn as well. I love hearing from listeners. Enjoy today's episode with Kim Scott, the author of the brand new book, Radical Respect. Kim, it is an absolute honor to have you on the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
It is an honor to be on the podcast. Thank you for having me.
You're out with a new book. It's called Radical Respect: How to Work Together Better. There's the book right there. It's out. By the time this releases, it'll be out. I've already seen people talking about it. There's a lot of chatter about it. So there's a lot that's probably changed about how you think about the workplace since Radical Candor came out, which is a super popular book.
Oh, thank you.
A lot of people I'm connected to just absolutely love that book. They talk about it a lot. I think I just did a podcast on it a few months back with some colleagues about it. And I'm just curious, what's changed for you that maybe inspired you to write this book?
Well, if you write a book about feedback, you're going to get a lot of it. And indeed, I did. And hands down, the most valuable feedback that I got was what prompted me to write Radical Respect. I was giving a Radical Candor talk at a tech company in San Francisco, and the CEO of that company had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade. She's a person who I like and respect enormously, and she's one of too few Black women CEOs in tech, or frankly, in any other sector. And when I finished doing the talk, she pulled me aside and she said, Kim, I'm excited to roll out Radical Candor. I think it's going to help me build the kind of culture I want. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to roll it out than it is for you. And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would give anyone, even the most gentle, compassionate criticism, they would call her an angry Black woman. And I knew this was true. And I knew how unfair it was because she's one of the most even-keeled, reasonable people I've ever worked with. And as soon as she said that to me, I realized 4 things at the same time. The first thing that I realized was that I had failed to be the kind of colleague that I imagined myself to be. I had failed to be an upstander for her. I had failed even to notice the extent to which she had to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant in every meeting we were ever in together, even though she had what to be pissed off about, as we all do at work from time to time. So that was sort of realization number 1, is that I had failed to be an upstander. I had been sort of a silent bystander instead. And that's really one of the roles that I think a lot about in the book, is how can we all be better upstanders? Because we all notice this junk happening. So that was number 1. Now, the second thing that I realized was that not only had I been in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to her as a Black woman in the workplace, I had also been in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to me as a white woman in the workplace. Kind of hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit it, But I'd gone through my whole career pretending that a whole bunch of stuff was not happening that was in fact happening. And I think the reason that I did that was that I never wanted to think of myself as a victim. But even less than wanting to think of myself as a victim, did I ever want to think of myself as the culprit? So this brings me to my third realization, was that I was most deeply in denial about the times when I was the one who had been disrespectful, or my disrespectful attitudes or behaviors had made it harder for my colleagues to get their jobs done, or my employees to get their job done. And which brought me to sort of realization number 4, which was that as a leader, I imagined myself to be creating these bullshit-free zones where everybody could do the best work of their lives and enjoy working together. But by ignoring disrespectful attitudes and behaviors, I was failing to live up to my goals as a leader. So that was a big drink of water, but it caused me to sit down and really think about what are the things that we can do as leaders? What are the things we can do as upstanders? What are the things we can do when we're the person who has been harmed by disrespectful attitudes or behaviors? And probably hardest of all, how can we begin to recognize it when we're the one who has caused harm with our disrespectful attitudes or behaviors?
I wasn't going to ask you this, but I'm just so curious because you've obviously gone through some self-awareness, self-actualization,
some analysis.
But with Radical Candor, there's a lot of people that have read that book and all the details of it and understand it. And then there's some people who are just taking that concept and thinking that gives them a permission to be an asshole. Do you feel like that book in some ways created a culture for some people who just didn't really understand the concepts and what you're actually saying in that book, and that you felt like, I need to really clarify and write a book about radical respect so people know that like the feedback's important, but there's a respectful way in which to do it?
Yeah. Well, I think anybody who read Radical Candor hopefully did not mistake it.
Right. I'm saying for the people that just read the title and they see the...
Yeah. The people who just... And that is true. That's other feedback that I got about Radical Candor. Often I'd be working with a team and somebody would charge into a room and they say, "The spirit of Radical Candor." And then they would proceed to act like a garden variety jerk. And that, of course, is not the spirit of Radical Candor. That's the spirit of obnoxious aggression. So I don't think, for the people who read the title of Radical Candor, but not the book, I don't think writing another book is going to solve that problem. They're not going to read the other book either, probably. There's an argument to be made that I should have called Radical Candor Compassionate Candor, which would have been much less likely to be misunderstood, but I think wouldn't have sold as many books. So anyway, I don't know. A 2-word title is risky. And in fact, Radical Respect is the paperback version of the hardback Just Work. That was another 2-word title that just didn't work. People thought I was telling them to return to office. And the other thing, fascinatingly, that I learned after Just Work, the hardback version of Radical Respect came out, was that a lot of people had problems with the language that I was using. A lot of people found that the language I was using around inclusion to exclude them, including words like justice, which I thought was like motherhood and apple pie. Like, I didn't think anybody had any trouble with the word justice, but it turns out they do. And so when I rewrote, and I pretty dramatically rewrote Just Work to bring you Radical Respect. So I cut 40,000 words, I reordered it.
Oh my goodness.
And I edited like every single word in the book to try to make it more straightforward for people.
There's so much in the book that we can't even cover on this podcast. And so I'm going to encourage people to go buy the book.
You and me both, please. Let's just pause there. Go buy the damn book. I spent a long time writing it. It's really
buy
good.
The damn book. I love it. Yeah. Well, especially if you're editing 40,000 words out of it, like that's hard in itself.
Yeah, cutting 40,000 words is, soul sucking.
Let's bring it back to an elementary level. When you talk about radical respect, how are you defining respect in the book? Maybe you have your own unique look at that.
Yeah. I don't think I have my own unique look, but what I did learn when I started thinking about respect, the first thing I did is I went to the dictionary. And it turns out there's 2 very different definitions of respect. One definition of respect is sort of admiring skills that somebody has built. So that has to be earned. And the other definition of respect is something that we owe to everyone. regardless of who they are. It's something we owe it to people to have a certain amount of regard for who they are, for their emotions, for their backgrounds. And so it's that sort of birthright respect, that core respect that everybody deserves. That is what I'm talking about. Language is so hard when it has two such very different meanings. One word has two such very different meanings. But what I'm talking about when I'm talking about radical respect is a kind of culture that optimizes for collaboration rather than coercion. There's checks and balances on power and that kind of stuff. And also one that honors everyone's individuality rather than demanding conformity. And it's kind of interesting to think what would possibly move us in the wrong direction me, I love a good 2x2 framework, but what would cause us to move away from honoring someone's individuality? Because I think when I go to work, I expect that people will honor my individuality. And I think of myself as the kind of person who honors other people's individuality. I don't expect everyone to be just like, I don't want everyone to be just like me. That would be awful. What could move me in the direction of demanding conformity? And I've worked with all kinds of different leaders. And I've never worked with a single leader who said, yeah, my goal is to create a coercive work environment. And I certainly never have met anyone who says, I would love to work in a coercive work environment. We know that our sort of superpower as humanity is collaboration. And so when we optimize for collaboration, we get more innovation, we get better work, we get people who like their work more and enjoy working together more. And yet sometimes, we're in a situation that does feel coercive. So how does that happen? So that's kind of what I was really trying to look at in the book, is what would move us away from radical respect. Because I do think it's something that almost everyone wants. I mean, I'm sure there's tyrants who really don't want radical respect, but everybody I've ever worked with, it's sort of what they long for.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the workforce has completely changed. I mean, a lot of it just the needs of people, the technology, and just like old habits are dying. Like the way of leading is changing a lot. A lot of people are waking up. And so I think this concept is ripe for the modern day leader and where we're all going. So I appreciate it. You talk about the framework for success. Can you define that? And how did you come up with that?
So the framework for success is really about optimizing for collaboration and honoring everyone's individuality. It's kind of like the strength of the individual is the team and the strength of the team is the individual. You don't have to choose between teamwork and yourself. On a great team, you get to be your best self, right? And I started thinking about, in many ways, radical respect is sort of the prequel to radical candor. Because radical candor is about caring personally and challenging directly at the same time. And if you don't respect someone, you're not going to care much about them and you're not going to bother challenging them directly or indirectly. You don't care what they think. And as I thought about, what is it that we need to enjoy working together again, I sort of feel like there's so much angst right now in the workplace and we need to start having fun at work again. And it was really asking that question as I was sitting all by myself in the shed in the backyard during COVID. There wasn't like some research. It was really about thinking about what are the kinds of work environments that have felt really exciting and fun and successful to me, and what were the elements of those. And that was what got me to come up with this radical respect framework.
I like how you put that radical respect in some ways as like a prequel to radical candor, because I do believe that we need this sense of like psychological safety in the workplace in order to be able to, hear the feedback and to be able to give it in a lot of respects. If you don't have that trust built and it's not a safe environment, like you're not going to be heard.
Yeah, you're not going to be heard. You're also not going to speak up. You're not going to take the risk of speaking up.
Yeah. You talk a lot in the book about the effects of bias and prejudice. What are some of those signs that you've seen or look for and that leaders might often overlook?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think about what gets in the way of radical respect, there's a million things, but I'm going to boil it down to three. There's bias, prejudice, and bullying. Those are sort of the root causes that take us in the wrong direction on those two dimensions of radical respect. And one of the reasons why they get in the way to the extent that they do, I think, is that we often conflate bias, prejudice, and bullying as though they're the same thing. And then the problem seems monolithic and almost insoluble and depressing. If we don't think we can solve the problem, we don't spend much time looking at it. So one of the things I tried to do in the book is to break these three things apart so that we could figure out what to do about each of them. So the first thing I tried to do is to offer some simple definitions. Bias is not meaning it, it's unconscious. Whereas prejudice is meaning it. It's a very consciously held belief, usually incorporating some kind of unfair and inaccurate stereotype. And bullying is just being mean. There's no belief one way or another. And given that these three things are so different, you can imagine you want different responses to each. So in the case of bias, I think you really want to use an I statement. An I statement sort of holds a mirror up to the other person to let them know what's going on. And ideally, it's the upstander who's using the I statement, not necessarily the person who was harmed. One of my favorite stories about this comes from a colleague of mine who went into a meeting with two colleagues who were men. And she had the expertise that was going to win her team the deal. So she sat in the center of the table and her two colleagues sat to her left. When the other side came in, the first person sat across from the guy to her left. The next person sat across from the guy to his left. And then everybody else filed on down the table, leaving her dangling by herself. That's often how bias shows up, just like who decides who's at the center. And she started talking, and when the other side had questions, they directed them not at her, but at her two colleagues who were men. And it happened once, it happened twice, and the third time it happened, you're shaking your head. You've seen this happen before, right? This is not an unusual
unique
story.
Situation. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And so one of her colleagues stood up and he said, "I think we should switch seats." So that was his I statement. That was all he had to do to totally change the dynamic in the room. Because as soon as he said that, the other side realized what they were doing and they stopped doing it. So why did it make sense for him to do that? I think there's three reasons. The first is that he liked her. It's kind of an emotional reason. He liked her and it bugged him that these people were ignoring her. The second reason is that he just wanted to win the deal. So there's a practical reason. He knew that they wouldn't win the deal if he couldn't get them listening to her. And then the third is sort of an efficiency reason. He also knew that she could speak up for herself, but he knew it was going to be easier for them to hear it from him than from her. So that was why he chose to speak up. Not because he was trying to be some kind of knight in shining armor or something like that. So I thought that was it's a simple story, but a good story about the use of an I statement. It sort of held up a mirror. However, if what is going on is prejudice rather than bias, holding up a mirror is not going to work. The other person's going to grin in that mirror. They're going to like what they see. And so in the case of prejudice, you want to use an it statement. An it statement sort of draws a line between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose that belief on you or on others. And an it statement can appeal to the law, it can appeal to an HR policy, or it can appeal to common sense. So here's an example of me using an it statement. I had just returned to work after having twins, after parental leave. And I was chit-chatting with a guy before a meeting, and he said to me, "Oh, my wife doesn't work because it's better for the children." And of course, this was like a stab to my heart. But I didn't think he really meant it the way it sounded. And so I said, "Oh, I decided to show up at work today because I wanted to neglect my children." And I was expecting him to laugh like you just did, and we would move on. I was using my I statement to hold up a mirror. But no, he was like, "Oh no, Kim, you should not be working right now. It is really bad for your children."
Oh my God.
Now I'm dealing with a prejudice. And believe me, he's not the only person who believes this. So I said to him, "It is an HR violation for you to tell me that I'm neglecting my kids by showing up at work." So that had the desired effect, like he backed off. But I think it's important not to over-delegate to HR in these kind of situations. And so I said to him, now I'm using common sense instead of the HR policy. I said, "Look, I'm not going to make a thing of this with HR, but I think you and I can agree that it is my decision together with my partner how we raise our children, just as it is your decision together with your wife how you raise your children." And he kind of nodded, but you could tell he's still and I said, "Look, I don't want to read your research any more than you want to read my research." And then he started to laugh and he said, okay, I get it. So that was using an it statement to deal with prejudice. And I was lucky in that case that I was working in a company. We were working in a company where the HR policy was on my side. But I think even just the common sense, it is my decision.
Yeah.
Just as it is but it was really, I'm grateful for the HR policy. Now, what if it's bullying? If it's bullying and you show somebody where the line is, they're going to try to kick past that line. That's the mentality. And you also don't, if an I statement sort of invites someone in closer to you to help them understand the situation from your perspective, that's not what you want to do if someone's bullying you. I learned this from my daughter. She was in 3rd grade. She was getting bullied. And I said to her, I was recommending an I statement to her. I said, tell this kid, I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah. And she banged her fist on the table and she said, Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded?
Oh,
that's a really good point.
For a 3rd grader.
It is a real, yes, it is a really profound point. And so we talked about it and we realized a you statement. A you statement kind of pushes someone away. So you can't talk to me like that. Or even a you question, like, what's going on for you here? Or even just a you non sequitur, like, where'd you get that shirt? The point of the you statement is that now you're not accepting whatever this person is dishing out. You're asking them to respond to you. You're in more of an active stance, not a submissive stance. You never want to be in a submissive stance when interacting with a bully. And you also, I'm a huge believer in vulnerability, but you do not need to show your vulnerability to a bully. That's not the safest. It's not the safest time for vulnerability.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those examples. Those are good.
Yeah, so that was what that's like the core of the book is like, what can you do as an upstander? What can you do as a person harmed? How can you know what to say when you don't know what to say? And if you think it's bias, start with the word I, see what comes out of your mouth next. If you think it is prejudice, start with the word it and see what comes out of your mouth next. If you think it's bullying, start with the word you and see what sometimes it's just like a momentum game. You got to say something.
I honed in on a part of your book that I'm seeing a lot lately where people, especially with remote work and video calls and especially group where the loudest person gets the attention.
Yes. The bloviating bullshitter.
Yeah. Some of the smartest and capable people are quiet and they just sit back on group calls and may not offer information that actually could change the trajectory of the conversation and probably help us all succeed and collaborate more. For those that are quiet, don't take up a lot of airtime. How do we give them a voice?
Yeah. And I think that's I love the way you asked that question because I do think that's a big part of what leaders should do. It's a leader's responsibility to give the quiet ones a voice. One of the things that you can do, and you don't have to be the manager of the team, but as a leader in a conversation to give the quiet ones a voice is just to be aware of airtime and to encourage everyone, actually, if you're meeting on a regular basis, to be aware of airtime. There's so much research that shows that on teams where everyone participates, where everyone talks roughly the same amount of time, they outperform those where one person, even maybe not the bloviator, maybe they really do know, but even if the person really does know what they're talking about, they should shut up. And if they don't know what they're talking about, they should definitely be silent. So simple things you can do are if one person is talking too much, say, I really value your input. I want to hear from everyone, and just go around the room. Sometimes asking everyone to go in turn is good. I think also talking to the quiet ones and saying, look, I notice you're quiet, and it's not a criticism. It's okay that you're quiet. It's okay that you only say something when you really want to. But I want to understand why you are not speaking up more, because I really value what you have to say. I've worked with people, this isn't always the case, but I have definitely worked with people who felt like they shouldn't speak up or like they were doing everybody a favor to get out of the meeting faster. They felt like withholding what they were thinking was doing everybody a favor. and pointing out, like, we hired you for a reason. You're on this team for a reason because we value what you have to say. And so you're doing us a favor to say it. And just because you're saying what you're thinking doesn't mean you're bloviating. So you've got to sort of encourage the quiet people to speak up, but you also need to shut down the bloviator. There's also like simple tactics. I learned this from a business school professor. He said, if someone is talking really loud and a lot, walk towards them. Like, your instinct is to walk away, but when you walk towards them, it quiets them down. And you can just give people the feedback. There's all kinds of tools. In fact, I think there are Zoom tools that will give you a percentage of time that you talked. So if there's a meeting of 4 people and you talk 50% of the time, like, you talk twice as much as you should have. And sometimes just helping people be aware of that is useful. I will admit I'm an over talker, as you can probably tell. One of the things that I found that I could do, and this was useful for me as I got more senior, I wouldn't have done this earlier in my career, but I would often offer to take notes in meetings because that forced me to shut up. So if you're one of those people who maybe is becoming aware that maybe you're taking up more than your fair share of the airtime.
Well, now there's AI tools for note taking, so that probably wouldn't work.
Yeah, well, yes. The other thing I do, which sometimes looks rude, but sometimes I'll play like 2048 and it helps me listen. Like, I think it's some form of, something that makes it hard for me to just sit and listen. So doodle if you need to doodle. Do what you need to do. There's a great book by Dan Lyons called STFU about how he learned the value of being more quiet.
I love it. You said in the book, and I'm paraphrasing this, that leaders need to be very conscious of limiting power to design effective management systems meant to optimize collaboration and honor each other's individuality, as you said earlier. How do we do that?
Yeah, so checks and balances on a leader's power are really important. I mean, it is important in a government system to have checks and balances. It's also important in a company. And the reason is that unilateral decision making is usually not the best decision making. The best decision making is when teams work together to make a decision. And also because power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. A little bit of power corrupts a lot. And so one of the things that I really admired about the management systems that Shona Brown designed when she was leading business operations at Google was that she really was very conscious about how Google was designing its management systems. And they stripped unilateral decision-making power away from managers. So a manager couldn't hire unilaterally. They couldn't pay bonuses unilaterally. They couldn't promote unilaterally. There were systems in places. There were lightweight. I mean, I hate process as much as the next person. So there were lightweight, fast processes that help managers make better decisions at every stage of the employee life cycle. And that meant that managers were not as likely to be abusive. The other big check and balance that managers had on their power at Google was if one of your employees didn't like working for you, they could go talk to other managers at Google and just switch teams. They could vote with their feet. And this happened to me. I tell this story in Radical Candor, where 3 of my 5 managers did not like what I was doing. And they all quit the same week. It was a difficult lesson, but it was one of the most important lessons I learned. Like, I needed to build relationships with power, with people, and lay my power down. I was moving too fast. So I think that's really important. Even if your company has not sort of gone through their management systems and stripped your unilateral decision-making power away from you, you can lay it down. You can say to your team, I'm not going to make this decision alone. I need input from you all on it. It's really important.
Yeah. And you talk about the design principles for radical respect, and it touches on a lot of different areas. Compensation can be one of them. It's designed to make systems more fair at every stage of the employee life cycle. And this is kind of what you're talking about, right? It's like stripping power and making it more of a systematic approach to something, right?
Yeah, there's two things you need to do when you're thinking about your management systems. Because if you don't design your systems to be fair, you're going to get systemic injustice. You just are.
100%.
It's going
Absolutely.
to happen. And so designing checks and balances at every stage of the employee life cycle on those decisions, and also quantifying bias at every stage of your employee life cycle is really important, because so often what happens at companies is what I would call almost unconscious discrimination, but it's still discrimination. So here's an example, I mean, sort of a funny one, although it wasn't funny at the time. I was coaching a CEO and he noticed that he had no women on his team. And to his credit, he did not assume the problem was the women at the company. He figured there may be a problem with the promotion process. So quantifying bias could be as simple as noticing that you have, in theory, you ought to have 50-50 male, female. You ought to have representation, racial representation, so on and so forth. So it doesn't have to be this super
Some analysis, business analytics guy. Yeah, right.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so he asked me to sit in, he hired me to sit in on the promotion process. And there were two people up for promotion, a man and a woman. And they were both great leaders. They were getting great results, and their teams were very loyal to them. And they referred to the guy as a great leader. And then when they started talking about the woman, they referred to her as a real mother hen.
Oh my gosh.
And I'm like,
The
okay,
self-awareness that people have.
back the train up. But this is the kind of stuff that happens, and it's easy to happen. I mean, and they at first were a little bit like, oh, Kim, it doesn't mean anything. I'm like, look, get real. Who are you going to promote? The real leader or the real mother hen? Like, words matter. And so I think it's really important to begin to look at if on a regular basis, the people you are promoting are not representative of the broader population, like, why not? Figure it out. I'm not saying it automatically means that it's unconscious bias plus power, which yields discrimination, but very often it is.
What is a bias buster, and how did you use one in your personal experience?
So a bias buster is someone either who you ask as a favor and then you do a favor in return, or someone you hire to actually help you become more aware of your biases. Because we all have a lot of biases. And if you really want to become aware of it, you need someone who, I mean, I guess some people can like be alone and become self-aware. I'm not one of them. I need other people. That's why I'm such a believer in feedback.
Yeah.
So it's like feedback. It's the person who's going to give you feedback about your bias. And part of the reason why you need to ask for this kind of feedback specifically is that people are really reluctant to give each other. I mean, it's one thing, it's hard enough to give people feedback about spinach in their teeth or saying too much. Is really hard to give people feedback about their biases. In fact, David Thomas, who's the president of Morehouse College, wrote a whole article about this called Protective Hesitation, which I recommend to folks. So anyway, I knew this was true. And I knew as I was writing Radical Respect, I really didn't, given I'm writing about bias, I better make sure I'm not using biased language. And so I hired Breeze Harper. If you are struggling, if you want a bias buster, nobody's better than Breeze. She was amazing. And I asked her to read the book and point out problematic language that I was using, biased language that I was using. Sometimes this used to be called a sensitivity read, but I think that's a bad word. I like bias buster better. And so she pointed out, maybe 7 or 8 words that I was using that were problematic. And my initial instinct was like, there's no word in the English language that's safe. I'm ashamed to admit that, but that is sometimes how we feel when people point out biased language, because these are like patterns of speech that we've been using.
They're ingrained in you, like from a young age too, and sometimes it's hard to kick it. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that Breeze pointed out that I was saying is I would say see when what I meant was notice. I was using sort of sloppy sight metaphors, ableist language. And that's an example, by the way, when I called it ableist language, some people thought that felt all wrong to them. They felt excluded from the conversation. So I'm like, okay, sloppy sight metaphors. And I understood what she meant. I agreed with her. And I really cared about this at a personal level because one of the people who was helping me to edit the book is blind. And so the last thing I wanted to do was use language that was not respectful of him, because I do respect him. And so I thought I had fixed it. And then right before I turned the book in, I did a quick search. And a 300-page book, there were 99 sloppy site metaphors after I had gotten the feedback and after I thought I had corrected for it. So we need to be persistent. I'm patient. It wasn't going to do me any good to go beat myself up for having done that, but I did need to be aware of it, and I did need to, if I wanted to change. So I think we need to be patient with ourselves and extend ourselves some grace, but also persistent in fixing the problem.
In the book, writing a letter to your younger self, what prompted you to include that, and what was the key message that you wanted readers to take away?
Well, so my first job out of college was I was working for a financial management company, and I was dramatically underpaid. I was sexually assaulted twice. It was a rough first job. And at the time, I just as I said in the beginning of our conversation, I was pretending that those things were not happening when they were in fact happening. So what I wanted to do after I wrote the book is go back to that first job and think about what's the advice I would give to my younger self, and also what's the advice I would give to the younger CEO of that company and to my younger boss. And the reason why I wanted to do that, part of the reason why I write the book I wish I had had 30 years ago to spare myself some pain. So that was part of the reason why I did it. But I also wanted to really go back and extend some grace, not only to myself, but also to the CEO of the company, who did not know that I had been sexually assaulted twice, but he had created a kind of situation where I was never going to tell him that had happened. And I don't think he wanted that to happen at his company, but he did want to underpay me.
Yeah.
And so I really wanted to go back and think, what could I have done differently? What could he have done differently? What could my manager in between me and the CEO have done differently? Because this is a book that's trying to solve problem. I'm not trying to describe problem. I'm trying to imagine solutions to problems.
Well, Kim, your book, Radical Respect, How to Work Together Better. It's great. There's so much in there that we didn't even talk about. I encourage people to go get the book. Any parting thoughts that you want to leave with people, or just any action items?
Yeah, I want to encourage people to end the default to silence. I think that there's so often, everybody who's listening can probably think of a meeting they were in the last 2 days where somebody said or did something and you're like, ooh, and yet you feel kind of gobsmacked. You don't know what to say. So I want to encourage people, especially if they're the observer, to try to intervene in some way. And even if you can't intervene directly, or you feel like it's not the right thing to do or not safe, you can check in with the person who was the target of that disrespectful behavior later and say, are you okay? That is really an act of kindness. You can also document what happened. You can delegate to someone else to intervene in some way. And you can also just create a distraction. You can spill your coffee. Sometimes that gives people. There are so many different ways for us to intervene. And I think it's important that leaders take action. But this is in order to solve these problems, everybody has a role to play.
I fully agree. My guest today has been Kim Scott, the author of Radical Respect. Kim, thank you so much for spending some time with me.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all your listeners for buying a copy of the book.
Yeah. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.